So I'm going to start off by telling you sort of what we do day to day, because I think some of you have heard various talks about what the software is or what we're trying to, the kinds of problems we're trying to solve, but don't really know who we are and the kinds of, and what we're doing on a daily basis. So this is the latest Hail Team photo, which I think is now correct, and we'll stop being correct in a couple of weeks. We're going to unfortunately lose our co-op Daniel and gain a couple of others this summer. But these are the 10 people who make up the Hail Team right now. And there are actually only 2 or 3 computer science degrees on the team. There are an alarming number of math degrees, which is concerning to me as somebody who doesn't have a math degree. There are a couple people with biology experience, but we're all software engineers on a day-to-day basis. So what does that actually mean? So you might think that means we're programmers, and that's true, but we're not the only programmers in the Stanley Center. Computational biologists are also programmers, and programming is really the tool that lets you solve various problems. And it's the kinds of problems we're trying to solve that differ between those two. So programming is the shared piece between computational biology and software engineering. And the piece on the other side of biology is the data science, the kinds of questions you want to ask, figuring out what your hypothesis is and how you test that with data. How you translate your questions into code is the programming side. And then you're going to use that information to update your model of the data and what you are actually trying to understand from it. So what's over here on the right side? This is the essence of software engineering. And I'm going to go through a couple of bullets of what I think this means. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. The first piece is that we have to coordinate hardware as well as software. We have to understand how computers work sort of from the ground up to understand how to use them effectively. And one important reason we want to do this is because we want our programs to run quickly. We want them to be performant. And to do this, you need to understand, well, how fast could my program run on this hardware? Well, given that I know how a computer works, what is the maximum possible speed my program could run at? And so once we achieve that speed, we know we're doing a good job. And we really want to make Hail about 3 times faster every year because our genomic data is growing by about a factor of 3 every year. And this is a really hard thing to do. If I ask you to make a car 3 times lighter per year, maybe the first year you can throw out the junk in your trunk and the air compressor and the stereo system. By year 2, you've not got a whole lot left. And this definitely is not you put in your work every year and you get your next factor of 3. It gets much harder every step of the way. And so to do this, you need to leverage multiple computers. You need to do distributed systems programming. You need to leverage techniques in computer science like compilers. This gets really tricky. You also need to know how to leverage available technologies to solve the problems that you have. So an example of this is a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago, Dan King helped Christina Chen, who's a computational biologist in Ben Neal's lab, run a singular value decomposition on an extremely large matrix. It was the matrix of UK biobank genotypes for about 100,000 or more variants. And she wanted to do a full singular value decomposition. This is a matrix that's about 400 gigabytes in memory. And this is something that does not fit on your laptop. You need probably dozens of laptops to fit it on that. And so what Dan did is he basically figured out how to rent the largest possible computer you can rent on Google Cloud and run existing numerical tools to actually run this algorithm. And it worked once. It didn't work any other times, but once was enough in this case. And this is a very hard problem that was solved not by using the Hail software, but by using the kinds of skills and techniques that we build up as software engineers. We also need to know how to understand what's going on elsewhere in the world of tech. So we do literature review of our own, trying to digest sort of coming advances in the field of tech and computer science. But we're kind of in a unique position in genomics where there aren't a huge number of existing open source technologies that work to solve our problems. So we need to do a lot of research to design new technologies. This is kind of scary to be in a world where a lot of the existing tools don't work super well, but it's also really exciting. I think it's why a lot of us are here doing what we do, that there's a lot of interesting ground a lot of opportunity to create new things. And this is basically what you're going to hear about in the next couple of talks. Specific questions where there's been some problem that needed to be solved to address the kinds of problems that the biologists or geneticists are facing here, and how exactly we go about solving those problems. We also need to build software systems that don't just work today, but that continue to work over time. And so to do this, we don't just want to basically write one-off scripts that work to get the paper out, which I understand is the incentive for academic publishing. We need to write things that continue to work, that are modular, reusable, and maintainable. And I will say that we're happy to help others in the Stanley Center move their own code in this direction when it's appropriate. We've done this a couple times in the past. It's been both fun and productive for everybody. We also think a lot about developer infrastructure, meaning things that we can do that don't directly develop the Hail software, but help us do our jobs better. And one example of this is the testing and integration work that we've done recently. So a continuous integration program is something that basically says whenever you make a change to your program, you should run all of the tests and do that immediately and return a report that says, okay, did my change actually break anything? And if it doesn't, you're good to go. You can let that change become part of the project. If not, you need to change it. And so we've done some work to build one of these services. There are others out there, but we have one of our own. We hope to actually expose this thing for use in the wider Stanley Center. If people have Python projects or other projects of their own that they would like to test using our service. And so the problem we're really trying to solve with Hail, the software, is that in 2014, the computational biologists were actually spending a lot more of their time doing software engineering-y things than the science. They had to manage clusters and figure out how they would shard up data and run it on the Broad Research Compute Cluster. Spend a lot of time optimizing their code because the data was getting really big. And this is not maybe the best use of that time because they're computational biologists. They should be spending time doing science. And so where we're trying to get to, where we're sort of in the process of becoming, is a world where people doing analysis on genetic data can really be back in the world where they spend most of their time doing science and a small fraction doing programming, which is the way you talk to the data. And so we need to address two things here. We need to make sure that they don't have to actually worry about managing their hardware and trying to make their code as fast as possible, spending a lot of time doing that. This is the software engineering bit. We need to make that smaller. We can do that by creating programs that can take advantage of multiple computers, for instance. We also need to make sure that they don't spend a huge amount of time doing programming. And we can do this by exposing the right kinds of vocabulary in the right programming languages that let you interact with genomic data as opposed to other kinds of data. Because there are great libraries out there for interacting with financial data, if you're like a time series analyst for a hedge fund or something, because people have this problem a lot. And Hail is an attempt to bring that kind of familiarity to genomics. So Hail the software is really 3 bullet points. Fundamentally, it's a library for general purpose data exploration and analysis exposed in Python. And by library, I mean it's a toolbox with all sorts of stuff in there. There's a whole lot of different modules, routines, and functions you can call in there that do a lot of things, both in genetics and just in general purpose data analysis. You might want to compute the mean of some field or compute any number of other like statistical things. But there is a whole lot of functionality that's really built for genetics. And importantly, this library scales from a laptop to a cluster, meaning that it's not good only for small data, and it is good for small data because it gives you the right way to interact with genetic data. But it's also good for big data because we can run on huge numbers of machines. So Hail, the same software can run in the same way on all the cores on your laptop, all the cores on some large server, or run on the cloud. This is what the cloud actually looks like, a data center in Iowa. And so people are generally running in Python notebooks, and this notebook could be connected, again, to a laptop, a server, or the cloud, and they're interacting with the data through these notebooks, using Python as the language. And something I just want to mention that you'll hear a bit more about later is that interactive visualization is something we're very excited about, that instead of just generating one single plot that you look at and try to zoom in on later, you can actually hover over, using other libraries, existing libraries in Python, you can make plots where you can hover over a point and see metadata about that point. In this case, I'm plotting, I think, like allele frequency versus some other metric in my data, and I can hover over a point and see both the coordinates and the genomic locus that it came from originally. And I want to close by discussing a little bit how we think about finding the right problems to work on to leverage our skills against. And there are really 2 phases of Hail's development in the past couple of years. The first phase was when we were starting out, we basically had weekly meetings with Stanley Center and ATGU scientists to figure out what were the big problems that were blocking people's analysis. and figuring out what tools were they using that were breaking down, what was slow, what was just not working at all. And so we could prioritize and build technology on a weekly basis that would enable the science that was happening. But in the background, we were figuring out, okay, we were using this data to calibrate what's the direction, the longer term direction we should be going toward in terms of building our infrastructure. But every week we were collecting more data about what are the problems that people are running into, and how do we, both on a short-term and long-term basis, try to solve them. But in the last year or so, I think we've entered a different phase of development where these low-hanging fruits are mostly gone. That the things people are asking for are generally either really hard to do, they're hard algorithms to implement in a distributed, scalable way, or they're just very long-term, they require a lot of infrastructure development to support them. And so we right now have a very flexible platform, which is driven by the development of the iterative, let's fix this problem and the next problem. So it's really possible to do a whole lot of things in this framework, but of course some things are going to be difficult. And so it's much harder to solve the problem of how do I make this set of things easier within the existing framework than how do I build some new set of distinct features. And I want to say that the problems in the wider community are now sort of within our purvey, within our scope. And so you're going to hear about, for example, the talk from Chris about thinking about new ways to represent large cohorts of genetic data. This is an example of a problem that the wider community is certainly facing, and many institutions. I mean, the Broad is leading because we have basically more data than anybody else in terms of trying to put together data sets like Nomad. But everybody is going to be facing this problem, whether it's this year or in a couple of years. And something we're even more excited about is expanding into new domains entirely, because this infrastructure is very useful for genomics, but it also really applies to other fields like single-cell RNA-seq. And so Jon is going to mention more about this in a couple of minutes when he takes the reins at the end. Okay, so with that, I would love to hear any questions if anybody has any. And again, we're happy to be interrupted by anybody during any of these talks. This is a good opportunity for discussion if anybody is curious about really anything about what we do day to day, the kinds of problems we're solving, if there are other things we haven't thought about. But if not, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to talk about. Yes, Rosie.
I have a question, but I need a mic.
I have a mic.
Oh, wait, here we go. Thank you. And I should say, anyone who has a question should use a mic because we're filming and people watching won't be able to hear unless you speak into a mic. My question is about the library part of what Hail offers.
Yeah.
Does that mean that people who are not at Broad and don't know you guys can use bits of Hail? Is it possible to interact with parts of the Hail software without human interaction? I think the human interaction part is great, but what if there are people out there remotely who want to interact?
So I didn't mention, but we have a quite wide user community now. I think that we probably have hundreds of active users, and we certainly don't have that many at Broad. I think we probably have maybe 30 or 40 at Broad. So the vast majority are outside. And so we have maybe 10 questions or maybe 5 questions a day on our user forum, and 10 or 12 people coming by to ask questions on our chat room. And that's actually where we provide most of our support to Broadies as well, just because it's more convenient to use those than to try to go find somebody. So yeah, it's entirely open source, meaning that anybody can go pick it up and play around with it, extend it, use it. All of our scripts to get started, for instance, on the cloud are also open source. So there are huge numbers of people who are using it outside the Broad, and some without any interaction. I mean, it is a thing that takes a learning curve, like any library, to get using, and so we do often encounter people as they're in that process. But yeah, by no means is it a Broad-only thing.
How do you manage your time then, you guys, if you have all these people asking
really
you for help?
So yeah, so as we grow up, one of the things we're struggling with is how do we build a support organization within our team? Because until now and currently, it's the engineers who are spending time answering user questions. And I think this is actually quite valuable as somebody who's done a lot of it, because it helps us understand what are the questions out there and what are the common themes. And often somebody will ask a question that they're asking A, and they really should be asking B. You kind of interpret this, the kernel of what they want to know is not the exact question they're asking. You know, it's something more specific, and there's a more general thing that should be addressed. And that's something to learn that it's hard. I think there's really no way to learn it without doing that kind of support work. But it's very valuable to the development process and shaping the direction of where we go.
I think I'll use that as a good transition to the next bit, because one motivation for the service that we're going to hear about is how we can scale the impact of Hail without going crazy by having more users and make it easier for them to use. Because we are seeing that usage happening not just in academia, but also in industry. And we want to support impact there as well.
Okay, yep. Thanks, Tim. So my name is Alex. I'm a recent addition to the Hail team. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about the service. And so really the motivating idea behind the service is that cluster management is really hard. So Hail provides a scalable platform, but it's still challenging to actually spin up the cluster to get those performance benefits that it provides, that it offers. So let's say that we're in a situation where we want to run some analysis. We write some amazing code, and we find out that it's too slow to run our laptop in the time frame that we require. Let's say it's due tomorrow. So our options are to submit the data and the software to the Broad cluster, and then we have to wait for a queue slot. And so depending on the occupancy of the cluster, we might not be able to afford that time. And so we might want to deploy our own custom cluster in the cloud. But that requires all of the complexity of managing that cloud cluster and obviously the direct costs associated with it. And so what we really want is a cost-sharing model and the elastic compute model that the cloud provides, so the cost-sharing model of the Broad cluster plus the elastic compute of the cloud model. And the cloud isn't actually a bad starting place because it isn't inherently expensive. And that is often sometimes something we find is a kind of a misconception. So if I wanted to say, spin up a cluster that just has the compute power of my laptop, that might cost something like $2 a day on that order. And if I wanted to replicate, say, the entire Broad cluster, I might be paying something like $1,000 to $2,000 a day. But it really isn't, the cost premium isn't particularly high. But managing a cluster, even with the wonderful interfaces that cloud providers like Google give us, is still pretty complex. So there's complexity on the hardware side. You have to make architectural choices like what CPU you're going to use, what the core count is going to be. You want most of your data to live in RAM probably, because RAM is orders of magnitude faster than persistent storage. And so you have to choose how many gigabytes of RAM to allocate. You have to make plenty of choices about the persistent storage as well. There are cost-benefit trade-offs between magnetic disks and solid-state drives and different interfaces for those solid-state drives. And there's plenty more detail on, besides that. This is just kind of an overview. And so I don't expect you to remember all of the kind of architectural details that you might need to think about, but just the takeaway should be that there are really a lot of knobs. So Google makes it easier, let's say, and Amazon makes it easier to spin up a cluster, but it's still not particularly easy. And there's, as soon as you start distributing, making distributed software, you have to, there's an interplay between the hardware choice and the software one. So you have to think about how you're going to handle failover, how you're going to handle data partitioning, because each one of your nodes needs to be able to handle those partitions. And misspecifying these details is actually quite hard, is actually quite costly. So on the hardware side, you really need to target your hardware choices to the workload that you have, and this is made more difficult by the fact that these hardware offerings change semi-annually, sometimes more frequently. So you have different cost-benefit analyses to make, on a sometimes monthly basis. There's also just some inherent idle time. So there's on Google Cloud right now, there's a 1-minute startup time, and so if you wanted to say run a workload that runs for 30 seconds, you have to keep in mind that you're actually going to pay for a full minute. And there's the manual shutdown, so you have to wait for your analysis to finish and shut down the cluster right in time, or you're going to waste money. And on the security side, there are pretty complex organizational decisions to make, so you have to make sure that you have all the correct certifications to place private data in the cloud and that kind of thing. And kind of from our perspective, you shouldn't really have to make these choices to get Hail's benefits. I don't know why that didn't work, but so we're designing a Hail service that scales to your workloads. It takes about 2 clicks to start and maybe about 10 seconds of ramp-up time. So the basic way that you access this is you go to the Notebook website, or in the future you will. There's a single button to click. You click that and wait for the notebook server to start up. And as soon as that's finished, you get access to Jupyter notebooks just like you would on your local machine, but in the cloud. And you don't have to think about what hardware choices to make in order to have your workloads finished in the time that you want. So the Hail service is really about Hail on an elastic cluster. Your data stays private, everybody's isolated, you pay only for what you use, and this will scale to workloads in the hundreds of thousands to 1 million samples. And the service model is really great because it allows us to make Hail even better. So from the workloads that people submit, we gain usage insights. This allows us to make more aggressive, better targeted optimizations in the Hail compiler. It allows us to make better architectural choices on the cluster side. And it will be cheaper because we get to multiplex workloads. So everybody's workload we expect has some downtime, some idle time, or some distribution and resource needs. And by overlaying all of these workloads, while still keeping them isolated, we get to gain economies of scale. And we know, for instance, that we have many industry users, but all of these industry users are running on their own clusters. By making our platform attractive enough for them to use, we get to grow our cluster and decrease the average cost per core, per gigabyte of RAM, per solid-state drive for everybody else. And so it's coming. It's in internal testing now. We're very excited about it. It's not quite ready to deploy to the broader Broad community or the world, but we're working on it as quickly as we can. And we look forward to sharing more soon. Thanks.
So in this model, who's going to be responsible for controlling data access? So right now, at least in our group, we have the very helpful Sam Bryant, who deals with all that. How are you going to do that going forward, especially with users outside of the Broad?
So I think the support model is something that we're still evolving. But as far as the who owns the data and where your data lives, it's going to be in your own bucket that you have access to. So you can still manage your own data. It's not going to be like we hold it on our servers for you. Yeah. Anyone else?
So maybe I'll say one more word about where we're at with this. So at the moment, there's a prototype that's being used by a couple heavy users on the 9th floor, and they're breaking it and helping us make it better. And our plan over time is to give access to a wider array of Stanley and ATGU users where the data snooping issue is less of a concern, and where we can really continue to make it better. I think the project of putting this out as a service to the world, especially if it needs to be compliant with the regulations that, say, a pharma company would need to have in place to use it, and also the billing, if we're going to have industry using it, a way for them to pay into our development. That's a longer arc, and one that will probably be quite collaborative with DSP and others who have been facing similar challenges. Okay, so next we have Chris. Chris is on the Hail team. He also participates in the MacArthur Lab, and so his focus has been one of Daniel's big concerns, which is to continue to grow the Nomad data set, with the latest iteration being, what is it, 150,000 approximately?
Getting there.
Whole genomes, which turns out to be a non-trivial VCF that you never want to make. So we'll hear about what we do instead.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Chris. I'm on the, as John said, I'm both on the Hail team and in the MacArthur Lab, kind of their first back-end systems engineer in service of the Nomad project. I have been in charge since about December. I have been in charge of doing initial call set production for Nomad v3 genomes, which is 148,433. So how I want to set this up is I want to talk a little bit about the inputs that go into these large data sets, go over how they're somewhat limited, how they're starting to have worked really well for almost 10 years, but as the data has grown at 3x per year, we've definitely reached a point where you just get to data that's too big, it becomes too expensive to compute on. And then I want to give a brief overview of what I've done to make this happen. And this is currently an estimate because we haven't actually made the data set yet, but we're looking at 6 or 6.5 times the data in twice the space. And we actually, in the process of doing this project, we have found ways where we think we could shrink it even farther. But that requires more changes upstream rather than what we're doing now. So to briefly explain the variant call format, or VCF, which is used for a lot of high throughput sequencing data, it's kind of like a spreadsheet, 1 column per sample, 1 row per variant, or potentially not variant. It's very general like that, but all of the rows are indexed by genetic locus, and you have a little bit extra for metadata. And so it looks kind of like this, kind of like if you like zoom out to kind of the perspective that I use, where the black boxes are variant sites, the white boxes are sites that don't vary. And so to get into some of the problems that this has or limitations, every new sample adds rows in addition to columns. I have some illustration of this in the next slide. And then you need to replicate all of your reference information at these new rows. And so you end up with a scaling problem that is worse than linear, which is, like, linear is about as good as you can expect. Just you add 1 sample and your data gets that much bigger, not that much and a little bit. And so here we want to add our 11th sample. So if it was just in its own VCF, it would kind of look like this, where it would just be its variance. But then when we add it, you can't actually do this with a VCF. That's another one of its limitations. You can't just add a sample, but you end up with a new row, and you need to replicate all of that data and get it from somewhere, and a new column that you need to replicate all of the sites that it doesn't have variance at, leading to a problem with variance. And so, so the actual input to this isn't, the input to my tool isn't a VCF, isn't a normal VCF. It's a format produced by the GATK tool out of DSP called a GVCF. And it's, zooming out, looks kind of like, if just a high-level perspective, it looks kind of like this, where you have the squares are your variant sites, your circles are your reference sites, and those lines that extend represent these what are called reference blocks. So you have large intervals of very similar reference information in the genome, because genomes don't vary that much, and so we take advantage. So our solution is to take advantage of these so this creates a sparse representation, and our solution takes advantage of this sparse representation to save space while also keeping more information around. And so this is kind of what our thing looks like from a high-level perspective, where you just line them up side by side, and you get your cohort. So in a normal VCF, basically every single position that you see there would have a dot, a circle, especially with which would be a lot of dots and a lot of data. And so we create, so the Hale data format that we map a VCF to is called a matrix table. It's basically a doubly indexed spreadsheet by locuses and samples. And so we produce a sparse version of this by joining them together, then need to do a little bit of munging to make sure everything stays correct. We keep all of our reference block information, but the fundamental relationship is one record in a GVCF is one record in a sparse matrix table, which gives us the data scaling properties that we need. And we make use of a tree merging strategy to go from 100 samples to 10,000 samples to 1,000,000 samples. So we'll join 100 at a time, and we'll join 100 hundreds, and then we'll join 100 10,000s, and then you have 1,000,000 samples. And so some of the challenges that this data can represent is that it's more complex. There's more that an analyst might need to think about, and I personally view it as my job to manage that complexity so that analysts don't have to. So if you need to think about the representation of your data, in some ways we may have failed a bit as an engineer, or I may have failed a bit as an engineer, not entirely, but that's the goal. But some of the benefits that we get is that our data is smaller, and smaller data means that it's more likely to be able to fit in memory. It's more likely to be able to, we need to like read and write less data overall, and that tends to be a slow operation in a computer, and so this can create speedups just by itself. Yeah, and so I'd like to kind of share a bit about some of my early results with this. So the project that we're targeting with this is the version 3 of the NOMAD project, the genome aggregation database. It's a large catalog of human variation, all jointly QC'd, summarized. Currently, these are released rather than what went into the initial data set. So it was like 150,000 exomes and about 22,000 genomes to start. Now, and then what actually got released is what you see on the slide. And then, so then I'm starting with these 148,000 genomes, and I'm hoping to put it all into about 50 terabytes. And this is the largest experiment that I've done so far, up to 10,000, because it's a lot of compute and very expensive, so we only want to do this one time. But you can see, so the blue here was produced by Laurent Franchioli in the MacArthur lab. He did that by taking the average size of a row as he downsampled and scaling it up to the number of downsampled and then took the average size of a row once he did that downsampling to produce the kind of greater than linear curve that you see there. I'm the orange circles at the bottom, which is very promising. That's what I have.
Can you describe the green?
The green is just, I'm taking my inputs and I'm summing their sizes. That's all. So we hope to preserve the same relationship that we get from just summing all of the sizes of all the input files with what we get in the output files. And it's actually a little smaller because of questions of representation and deduplication of some per file data, but I think it's very impressive and I'm very proud of this work.
Questions?
Thanks, that's really, really impressive. My understanding of the nonlinearity is that it's due because as you add a new sample, there's a new variant, and then you have to go back and add rows for previous samples you had processed. It seems like this approach handles that by pre-storing the reference block informations from the previous samples. So is that really solving the nonlinearity or putting more work up front to handle it?
It does, because we're not adding more entries. When you think about it, you don't get, because if you have like some rare variant and you need to fill in an entire row, and then that sample also has things that don't vary in itself, and you need to fill in all of the rare variant, where it doesn't vary for all of the other samples' rare variants. And so you do end up with one record turning into thousands or 10,000s or hundreds of thousands, because whereas we store a little bit more, in some ways we're storing way more information. There's actually about 5 times as many reference blocks as there are variants in your average sample, but you still end up with smaller data.
Another way to think about it is that
Another way to think about it is that you're scaling linearly in variance and constant in samples. I think that's the big win.
Yeah.
Sorry, just one more note is that this format actually has a feature that the VCF doesn't, which is that you can take 2 of these and smash them together and get a new one of these. If you have 2 VCFs, and you can't really merge them without losing information. So this has an extra feature as well as being more performant in both size and compute.
This seems like the ideal solution for an online incremental.
Yeah, totally
a
incremental
little
is
bit
a
of-
little challenging, but being able to merge in a new batch of samples seems like a great application.
Yeah, you can either take 2 large cohorts and merge them online and perform analysis, or you can take smaller cohorts and merge them. You can take smaller cohorts and merge them together to form a big cohort, and you can build up the cohort over time. Yes, Claire.
Can you say something about how this would change like an analyst's workflow if they're using a tool that's still expecting VCF format as they all are now? Presumably they need to convert file format. How difficult is that? Does that then make this not worth doing? How should we think about that?
If you already have a full VCF, you should use what you have. But we're looking to bring this into the pipelines that DSP uses for data delivery and other things, and we're working with the VCF spec, or I'm working with the VCF spec committee to take parts of what I've done and bring that into the VCF spec to start solving its issues. And so the tools should, this is the first tool, this is the implementation where I'm the one with the hundreds of scripts all over the place, but we're working to make sure that there is a uniform set of tools that analysts can use for working with data like this.
And
There was a recent meeting in England of the GA4GH where Yossi. Is it on? I think it's on. Yeah. Where Yossi, we've been working with Yossi and some groups in DSP to port these IDs to VCF, and that was presented. And there are now, I think, 3 competing standards, and there was a lot of interest in this because it involves only a small modification of the VCF standard, but gives you the sparse representation. So I think that the tools that are not Hail, that people are using to process VCF, if this goes into the spec, then those tools should be modified to process this, and we should be able to get good interoperability between Hail and existing tools.
And maybe one point on, using the existing Hail methods on this format. It's a sparse format. As you're passing through it, you can densify it, which might not be the optimal computation to do. So you're counting the number of variants that are non-reference. Well, actually, we can do it much faster in this format per sample because those are the only ones that are there, right? It's like a sparse array, and we're adding it. And so where it's possible to take advantage of that sparse format to get better analysis efficiency, we should do that. But there's a generic thing you can do, which is just blow it back up as you compute on it to maintain usability with the existing tools, at least internally. And then we want to make sure, of course, you can just export a piece of this as a VCF for use in another tool. But how big would this be as a VCF, Nomad v3?
400 terabytes.
400 terabytes, so
300. It's a lot of data.
So you probably wouldn't want to export the entire thing for any other tool anyway. Yeah.
I mean, you already don't really want to export 50 terabytes.
Great.
But thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to put the screens up. Are you doing a demo first?
He's doing Chalk Talk.
Tim's going to set up my computer while I start my board.
But set it up for
I'm going to do a quick demo.
the demo first, yeah. After, okay.
Hi, everyone. Markers. All right, so I'm going to give you, start off with a simple high-level model of what distributed computing is and some of the problems we can solve in that model. And then I'll mention some of the problems that if your data were just on a single computer, it would be easy, trivial to do, but are surprisingly difficult to do when they're all spread across a large cluster. And one of those problems is just get a sense of the distribution of your data, like a PDF plot or median or quantiles. So that's difficult when your data is distributed in some arbitrary way in lots of pieces. So I'll talk about some work I've been doing, and then I'll give a quick demo of some nice plots that we have in Hail now using these methods. This model I'll call a partitioned streaming model. What? Black? So you have some data. It's split into some number of partitions. So a simple picture, say we have 3 partitions, and our data is just some integers. And then anything we want to compute on this data, we can compute on each partition in parallel at the same time. But on each partition, we're only allowed to just sort of stream through one at a time. We can't go back and look, basically because even on one partition, this data might be very big, and we're just reading it off of some hard drive or so slow storage. And so we just want some small state that we keep in memory. And we update our state as we see each number. And that's all we're allowed to do. So each partition just streams through the data once. And then at the end, so each partition has its state that it has after it's seen all the data. And they all communicate whatever they have at the end to some central location or computer. And then that's the computer responsible for combining all these into some final answer. So maybe the simplest example I can start with is just, what if you want the sum of all of your data, right? So then each partition has some state, And the state is just these running sums. So you read the first number, that is your first sum. And then each time you read a new number, you update it with the next running sum. Right, and so on. So each partition has its running state. At the end, that state is the sum of that partition. You communicate all those local sums to some central computer, which can then add them up. Right. If you wanted to, say, just count how many values are in your data, you don't care what they are. That's basically the same thing, right? You just read each number one at a time, ignore what it is, just keep adding one to your state, and then combine them all and add the local counts. So these are some easy problems. So we know how to do sum, we know how to do count. Average is just sum divided by count. But this is already a little bit interesting because we can't say our local state is just the local average. Right? We can't take the average of each partition and then there's no way to combine them to get the global average. But we already know how to compute the sum and the count. So we can just keep both of them as our running state. Right, so now we need a little bit more memory we're using on each partition. So we can communicate the local sum and count to the central computer, which computes the global sums and counts, and then from that, the average. So some other problems. Here's one that it might be easy or it might be very hard, depending on what your data is. What if you just want to know so in the example I drew, all these numbers are distinct. But you might have some data where you have lots of different numbers or strings or something, and some of them are repeated many times. And you want to know in the end, like, what are all the distinct values, and for each one, how many times did it appear? So if the number of distinct values is small enough that you can fit that in memory, then this is easy. You just, so you stream through your data. For each one, you keep a list of all the distinct numbers that you've seen so far. Each time you see a new one, you ask, is this already in my list? If not, I add it, and then I increase the count on that number. And then, so if these are small enough, we can send them all to the central computer, which can combine them. The problem, of course, is if your data, if you have like millions of numbers and even after you deduplicate them, it's still like a million, and maybe this is too big for you to fit in memory, then it just, there's no way you can do this exactly, because even the answer you're asking for is too big. And so there's other problems that fit into this, where if the number of distinct values was small enough, this would be easy, but otherwise, it's not clear how you can do this. Like you might want to know just how many distinct values are there. That seems easier than keeping a count for each distinct value. But there's no way to do this exactly without actually keeping a list of every distinct thing that you've seen so far. Or related to that, you might just want to know, so some of my numbers are repeated many times, and some of them only happen once or twice. And I just want to know, what are the most frequent ones? Maybe those are the most important. Or a different kind of problem, so the one I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, is what if you want to know the median or some other quantile? So this seems similar to the average, and the average was very easy to do. But for a median, there's no way to do it exactly without basically having all of your data in one place and sorting it, and then taking the middle one. So if you can't, if you're not allowed to combine all of your data in one place, then it seems impossible to compute the median. But so this is a large area of computer science which studies these problems, where it is possible if you can tolerate approximate answers. So, and then you get this whole spectrum of you can trade off how much memory am I willing to use to do this computation versus how much error am I willing to accept in my final answer. And so one of the common names for this field is called sketching algorithms. And so the basic idea is you want to compute some sketch or some small summary of your data. And so this summary has to fit into this easy column. There has to be a way to just scan through the numbers one at a time and then combine the sketch from each partition into the final sketch. And then from that small sketch, you want to be able to answer maybe many queries. So a query might be like, what's the first quartile, or what's the median? So you should be able to compute some summary that you don't need to know what questions you're going to ask of it yet. And then once you have that, you can sort of interact with it and ask, what's the whole distribution of the data? What are all these different quantiles? OK, so I'll quickly tell you one of the insights that makes this, the quantiles problem possible in this approximate model. And then I'll give a quick demo of what these ideas have enabled in HALE. So first, it turns out that answering quantile questions, like what's the median or what's the first quartile, these aren't, it sounds like just asking for one quantile is easier than like asking for all of them at the same time, the entire distribution. But it turns out that it's really not. And so I'm going to turn this into a slightly different but very related problem. So this is the problem of, given this summary of the data, if I give some number like 10, then I want to know what's the rank of 10. How many numbers in this whole data set are less than 10? So that's a formal way of saying, like, I want to know the entire distribution of the data. So I want to know, given any number x, how many values from my data set are less than x. And so we can only do this approximately. And so the idea is, what are some ways to take this large amount of data and turn it into some much smaller data where I can answer this question with some error. So I want ways of reducing the data by a lot while only introducing a small amount of error. I actually wanted to save these. So this is actually, this is a problem that has had lots of work done on in this sketching algorithms literature. And there's a few different approaches to it. But there's one whole family of approaches that's based on this one simple building block. And that is, so what if at least this one partition of data is small enough to fit into memory? If it's not, I could just stream through until I get to the cutoff of what I'm able to work with in one chunk and sort of split this into some larger number of virtual partitions. But so if this is small enough that I can just load it into memory and then sort it, then I can throw away half of these numbers by just keeping every other one. And then so that is what I'm going to send to the central computer. It's just half of the numbers from my partition. Right, so I can do that here too. And I wanted to throw away half of them, but I didn't have to start with the first one. I might start with the second one and then take every other number. And so it turns out we get the best control over the error if we just choose this randomly. We just flip a coin, and we either start with the first or the second number, and then from there we take every other one. So maybe this time we start at the second one too. And then so the central computer takes all of these summaries and sorts them. And then this sorted list is my sketch of the distribution of the data. So it's always exactly half the size of the whole distributed data. And of course, this isn't going to be enough in practice. Half of a huge data set is probably still huge. But this is a building block that you can repeat. You can like do some hierarchical strategies. So this is where there's more work to do. But notice, like from this sketch, we might estimate 16 is the median. And 16, so we would estimate its rank. Since each of these numbers sort of came from two numbers from the original stream, we'll count each one of these twice. And so if I want to know how many numbers are less than 16, then I count each of these twice, and I say the rank is about 6. But if you look up here, there are 7 numbers that are less than 16. And if you take any number, I think in this example, they're all within 1 of the real answer. And so formally, what it's not too hard to prove is that for each partition, each time we sort and then throw away every other number, we add at most 1 to the error of any rank estimate. So in this example, we've added at most 3 to any rank estimate. And even if the partitions were not just 4 numbers, but thousands of numbers, we would still be adding at most 3 to any error estimate. And since for each one of these, we're adding a plus or minus 1, and it depends on whether we started with the even or the odd numbers. And so we're adding a bunch of plus or minus 1s. Each of them is uniformly random. And so actually, a lot of these cancel out. And so that's where we get pretty good accuracy from this. OK, so let me, can we put the screen down again? OK, so I've implemented a method from a paper from just a couple of years ago. This is a very active area that actually gave a provably optimal method for this problem. So we have that in Hail now, and we can use that to compute like medians or other quantiles. But the funnest example is we can draw plots based on this. So here this computes this sketch of the data. Like I said, it's basically just a cumulative density function of the data. And I can turn that into a plot. And notice I've told this plot nothing about what I expect the distribution to be. I don't need to choose bin sizes or boundaries or anything. And I just always get, so you can interactively look at the ranks of different numbers in this distribution. Here I put the exact distribution over it. You can see that it's pretty accurate. But usually more useful is to see the density function. And there's actually some interesting work in going from this approximate CDF to a PDF, because if you zoom in here, you can't really see here, but this is not at all smooth. It's really a step function. So I can't do anything like take the derivative. But there are some nice ways you can do that. And again, if I draw the real density function on there, it's a pretty good match. And even this making no assumptions about my distribution being smooth, even for a completely discontinuous distribution, we still get this nice approximation. And because this fits in this partition streaming model, it's completely scalable. Right? No matter how big your data is, you just throw more partitions at it, and you get very interactive visualizations of your data. Okay, that's it.
Can you say something about how much of the data you need to keep to get a reasonable approximation?
So yeah, in the end, the amount of data you need to keep doesn't depend at all on how much data you start with. It only depends on how much error you're okay with in your estimates. So if you want your quantiles to be within plus or minus like 0.1%, then you have a certain amount of data you need to collect. I think it comes out to something like 1,000 numbers in your sample. And that's completely independent of how big your data was to begin with.
Any other questions? All right, thanks, Patrick. So I'm gonna turn this off. And put this up. Thank you. All right, we're running short on time, so I'm gonna be briefer than I intended. Yes. I think I'm going to stick to two fairly high-level points. So the first is something that Tim mentioned at the end of his talk, which is that Hail really began as a project to confront the challenge of the growth of genetic data and our interest to continue to do genomic sort of GWAS and other studies, rare variant studies, and so on, like we've used to do, but do it productively even as the data grows and grows and grows. And so a lot of the first version, let's say Hail 0.1, was very much hard-coded for the problems of genetics. Our core data structure, this matrix table, sort of a two-dimensional spreadsheet or SQL table where you have variants and you have samples, and these entries are like the fields that you get in a BCF from GTK. That was all hard-coded, and the idea was to just enable us to do things like the UK Biobank and nomad scale analyses, but also to let people with smaller data interact with the data much more efficiently to reduce the latency from when they have an idea of something they want to do and model to actually just doing it, right? Now, in terms of expanding scope, there's a lot more science happening in the Stanley Center than just statistical genetics. In fact, there are a lot of projects where the data types described in the grants for those projects, like the Convergent Neuroscience grant, for example, that's going to involve organoids. It's going to involve genetic data because it's mixing together many lines of they're not stem cells, they're iPSC, yeah. We're going to have RNA, we're going to have imaging, probably electrophysiology at some point. There'll be lots of data types, and recognizing that in many cases we're going to want to analyze and model data that spans many data types and might all be big, it would be very impactful to be able to do that in a way that was within an ecosystem rather than having 100 tools where you have to export and import and export and import and so on. So that's the goal. We're not there. But I wanted to give you a sense of kind of what we think is maybe our next step and what that's motivating in terms of infrastructure. So if we think of Hail as now trying to, say, take what you could do in Python, but allow you to do it even when your data gets big, then you could think about genomics as a module or library within Hail, meaning that it's built on top of this, and it has particular types, like a genome reference or locus or variant that are quite specific to genetics, and also various functions, like computing an LD matrix or a TDT test or so on, that are also quite specific to genetics, but they are written in Python on top of this core Python library, which itself is communicating with a backend written in currently a lot of Java and Scala and using Spark, but we're building a C++ version of that. And the point, though, is that this shouldn't really matter for the user. Okay? There are some backend or maybe multiple backends, and on the front, it's scalable Python, and there's genomics. Right. So in the last year, we've done a lot of talking with folks who are using single-cell RNA-seq data, right? So I could write single-cell. Let me just be a little more specific. Let's think about all the things we do with single-cell data, such as a count matrix of gene expression per cell. There's a lot of functionality here that we don't yet support directly in Hail. Many people are using R or Python, and in many cases that's just fine because the data sets haven't gotten too big, but it's very clear if we look at the trajectory of single cell, it's growing even faster than genetic data, closer to 4 or 5x per year, and so we'll soon find ourselves in a similar situation to genetics, where things just slow down quite a lot and the science slows down if you can't scale. All right, so in talking to these scientists, one thing that became very clear was that we would need a lot more support for linear algebra, scalable linear algebra. Whereas here, a lot of the operations felt more like SQL, like querying and filtering and so on, especially for QC. And then there was some linear algebra, like principal components, for example, or computing a correlation, like LD. And even though there is linear algebra also in doing a GWAS, that GWAS linear algebra, it's a bunch of parallel small linear algebra. For each variant, you're doing a linear regression, right? And a lot of that code, where there was linear algebra involved, we wrote it in Scala back here, where the users really don't have visibility. It's not a language they're used to. That's the main part of our methods code base that hasn't yet been lifted, the parts that use matrices. So recently, we've added another type to Hill's set of types. So the type is an ND array, and it's meant to look and feel like a Python n-dimensional array, which can represent a vector, a matrix, or a higher dimensional array. And with this type, what we're hoping to do is both lift the remaining genomics methods that use linear algebra up to Python so that users can see that code and they can modify and make their own. But we're also hoping to build big linear algebra that is made out of these small pieces. So for a user, we're hoping we'll get to a point where if you have say a matrix and it's 1,000 by 1,000 and you want to invert it, go ahead. If it's 1,000,000 by 1,000,000, well, it's going to cost a lot more, but maybe we can actually, make it possible to do that, and it should feel kind of similar. That would be like a goal. And to make that more concrete, in interacting with Gord and Jordan's teams and in particular Bram and Giuseppe, you know, there's a problem they have, which I think is very motivating for us in terms of thinking about where we'd like to go in this direction. So they're looking at ontogeny of interneurons. They want to map out the tree that goes from the progenitor to the mature types at like day 54 postnatal in mice. And they have data sets at different time points, 6 different time points of single cell, each with about 10,000 cells. It's a really nice problem. And so what do you want to do? Well, to start, you probably want to do some kind of clustering within, or modeling or dimensional reduction within each time point. And then you want to kind of connect those clusters together and hope that gives you some kind of tree describing how the cells are differentiating as they mature. And the technique that they're using is non-negative matrix factorization, because they have a matrix of counts, which are non-negative, and they factor that matrix of cells and genes into a tall, skinny, and a short, fat matrix. And one of these is representing like genetic programs, and the other is representing loadings on those programs of the cells. And this, you hope, is a more interpretable basis for describing what goes on in a cell and then describing cell types in terms of those genetic programs. OK, I don't want to go into detail because we're almost out of time. But to make this more robust, when you run an MF, it requires a seed. You start somewhere and you do some sort of iteration, some gradient descent. And where you start that off will affect where you end up. It's a non-convex problem. There are many local minima, right? And so every time you run it, you can get a different answer. And there's this question, like, what's the right answer? And we're not sure, but it turns out that if you run it a bunch of times and you look at these genetic programs and you look to see, do some of them occur robustly? Do they occur no matter what seed you started with? That those programs tend to be more interpretable on average. Not always, and these aren't original ideas to us. There's others who have done this consensus method. There's a really nice talk in MIA by Dylan and Alex Gueva about NMF and of consensus NMF. So what's the problem? The problem is he now wants to run NMF on this matrix 250 times for every time point. And it turns out the Broad's cluster, because of the queue, it's impossible for him to do it productively. It turns out that Gord secretly has some access to some computer somewhere else with 40 cores, and so Bram's been using that. And it takes him, to run it 250 times for one time point, it takes 24 hours. And, well, he wants to run it for 6 time points, but this is also method development, right? So as soon as he gets these answers back, it gives him ideas, and he wants to do it again. And then it's another 24 hours, right? If you have a problem like this, come talk to us. Because it's not that we can solve this in HALE immediately. Our goal, longer term, right, is to build the linear algebra primitives, such as matrices and vectors, that we can implement the NMF algorithm in HALE, like it was being implemented in Python, and then bring to bear as many computers as we want and be smart about how we do that computation. And so we wouldn't even need someone as clever as Bram to solve this problem. How do we make this go faster instead of a day? Now, Bram is pretty sophisticated. So we talked about it, and we made sure he was aware that like he can talk to Sam, and he can get a Google Cloud account, and he can then go get some money from Gord, and he can, instead of it taking a day, we can divide by 250, because he can just spin up 250 VMs and run it, or Dockers, or whatever, and now it's going to be 6 minutes, because it's just going to run in parallel. And I think the difference between waiting for 24 hours and 6 minutes will be very qualitatively different in how fast he can iterate on this project. Right. But as I mentioned, our hope is that instead of Bram, which he'll do in the short term, writing some bash, some code to handle a bunch of Google VMs all at once to do this, that it would be possible for someone less sophisticated to just use HALE to orchestrate something like this scalably. All right. Now, the last thing I want to say is that even this idea of doing it in 6 minutes instead of 24 by doing it in parallel, it's still going to cost. The idea is it should cost the same because you're paying sort of for core hours. So it should cost the same. It's the same amount of compute. You just get it back sooner. But as our data gets huge, instead of 10,000 cells, what if we had 1 million cells, right? And we wanted to use a ton more factors because there's just more resolution. Even this cost is going to start to go up quite a bit. So here's where we might want to be more clever about using mathematical or machine learning ideas to say, well, if we're going to fit it that many times, is there a more clever way to get that many solutions more efficiently than just starting over from scratch every time? Maybe we could do some kind of bifurcating descent search process or something. Okay, so I don't know. It's something I'm thinking about with an intern this summer. But I wanted to make clear that I think part of how I would hope Hail can be helpful in Stanley, in addition to building the core infrastructure, is that there are certain problems which aren't yet ready to go straight into the machinery we've built. But they're really good problems for us to be aware of in the community because they help us understand what infrastructure we could build that would be impactful not just to solve that one problem, but to solve, hopefully, lots of problems for lots of people. And I'd like to think about it kind of like this. So there's biology, for example, last summer, Alex Gova, Cotton, and an intern, Daniel Kunin, and I were thinking about biology. We were thinking about single-cell and dimensional reduction. And we had some ideas about PCA and autoencoders, some machine learning stuff. And that ended up going into a machine learning paper. And this machine learning paper doesn't mention biology at all. But it was accepted to ICML, which is like the science, I guess, of machine learning. And we're going to give a 20-minute presentation, which is a pretty good honor. And we're going to share it there in a couple weeks. Now, you could ask reasonably the question, why is it worth our time writing up a theory paper about machine learning that doesn't mention biology? And I want to make the argument that, well, you could say, OK, we do that. And then if those ideas are useful broadly, because they're kind of just math, maybe finance people will benefit, and maybe the tech companies will like it, or maybe something we can feel like climate change will help those people. Maybe that one we're good with. I don't know. But the point is, if other communities find it useful, then they're going to be interested in paying it back. They're going to want to make those methods better also. And then the beauty of it is that all these people, we don't have to pay them. In fact, a lot of these people are pretty expensive. But if we engage in not just applying existing things, but building the things that really are special problems in data demand, and making those ideas out there and then others iterating with us, I think this is a really good cycle to make sure that we're taking advantage of all of the mathematical and computer science ideas and engineering to make our science go. So thanks so much for sitting through 90 minutes of this content. I hope you learned something. And please find us in your friendly neighborhood Hail team on the 9th and soon to also be 8th floor. We'd love to talk to you.